On September 14, 1944, as Allied forces surged across Europe like an unstoppable river, Antwerp became more than just a city on a map. It transformed into a pivotal point, a true artery, without which further advance into Germany would have been unthinkable. This largest deep-water port in Europe, capable of accommodating dozens of ships simultaneously, promised to solve the acute supply problem that was strangling the Allied armies. Thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, all of this was supposed to pour through Antwerp to support the rapid advance of the troops. For the Germans, its loss meant disaster. They understood that without this port, the Allies would slow down, and then they would have a chance to regroup, to strengthen their defenses. That is why Antwerp turned into a battlefield where each side was ready to fight to the last. By September 1944, the situation on the Western Front resembled a boiling cauldron. Operation Overlord had been a resounding success, and after the breakout from Normandy, Allied forces like an avalanche surged eastward. Paris had been liberated, and the euphoria of victory was palpable in every headquarters, in every division. Generals dreamed of a swift end to the war, of entering Berlin before Christmas. However, this euphoria was deceptive. The rapid advance also had a downside. Logistics couldn't keep up. Dozens of divisions, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of pieces of equipment, all required a continuous flow of supplies. Fuel, ammunition, food, all had to be transported hundreds of kilometers from the shores of Normandy. The ports captured by the Allies were either destroyed or too small to handle such a volume of cargo. Europe's railway network was heavily damaged by bombing, and then Red Ball entered the scene, an improvised system of truck convoys that became a real salvation, but also a headache. Thousands of trucks, rushing along the roads of France, transported vital cargo, but their capacity was limited. Each truck required fuel, and every transported bucket of gasoline meant less ammunition or food would reach the front lines. The generals, Eisenhower and Montgomery, found themselves embroiled in heated debates. What was more important, a broad front and a uniform offensive, or a concentrated strike in one direction that could break through German defenses? Montgomery insisted on the latter, seeing Antwerp as the key to success. He understood that without a major port capable of receiving ocean-going vessels, any further offensive would falter. The supply problem was becoming increasingly acute, threatening to halt the Allied advance despite their military successes. Every kilometer gained eastward amplified the logistical nightmare, making Antwerp not just a strategic objective, but a vital necessity. Against the backdrop of this logistical catastrophe, Field Marshal Montgomery, an ambitious man convinced of his own righteousness, proposed a daring plan that he believed could turn the tide of the war. Operation Market Garden, as it was named, envisioned a rapid thrust through the Netherlands. The goal? To seize key bridges over major rivers, the Maas, the Waal, and, most importantly, the Rhine. The success of this operation would allow the Allies to bypass the formidable Siegfried Line, enter German territory, and possibly end the war before Christmas. It was a plan that reeked of risk and grandiose ambitions, but crucially, it was inextricably linked to Antwerp. Montgomery understood. If Market Garden succeeded, the captured Antwerp would become an ideal base for supplying troops that had broken through into Germany. The port was to provide colossal volumes of cargo necessary to sustain an offensive on such a broad front. He saw these two operations as two sides of the same coin, one securing the breakthrough, the other its sustainability. But there was a nuance. General Eisenhower, supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, adhered to a different strategy. His concept of a broad front envisioned a uniform advance along the entire front line to prevent the Germans from concentrating forces in one sector. Eisenhower feared that concentrating all resources on one, albeit grand, operation could weaken other sectors and lead to disaster in case of failure. These strategic disagreements created tension between the two commanders. Montgomery, with his British pragmatism and drive for decisive action, saw excessive caution in Eisenhower. Eisenhower, in turn, considered the British Field Marshal too overconfident and prone to excessive risk. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. Operation Market Garden received the green light, but troops in other sectors of the front continued to advance, albeit not as rapidly as Montgomery would have liked. This seemingly reasonable decision had unpredictable consequences for the Battle of Antwerp. All the energy, all the resources that could have been directed towards immediately ensuring the port's operation were shifted north, to the Netherlands. The command's attention was fixed on the bridges over the Rhine, not on the Scheldt estuary, where the Germans, taking advantage of the delay, began to fortify their positions. And while paratroopers and airborne troops prepared for jumps in the Arnhem area, the fate of Europe's most important port remained hanging in the air. This was a moment when Allied priorities shifted, and this shift became a fatal error, for which many lives and 4 months of delay had to be paid. And so, while the attention of the Allied command was focused on the airborne landings over Holland, a different, no less dramatic story was unfolding on another sector of the front. On September 2, 1944, the British 11th Armoured Division, known as the Steel Rats, received an order: Antwerp. Major General George Roberts, a decisive man not prone to delays, immediately set his troops in motion. Their thrust was truly lightning fast. In 2 days, ignoring fatigue and the resistance of scattered German units, the Steel Rats covered over 100 kilometers. This was an incredible achievement for that time, when logistics and road conditions often hampered torpedo movements. They didn't just drive, they flew, sweeping away everything in their path. German patrols, small garrisons, bewildered retreating units, none of this could stop Roberts' tanks and armored personnel carriers. The British used tank cavalry tactics, not lingering at small pockets of resistance, but bypassing them and continuing to move towards the main objective. Their goal was not to destroy every enemy encountered, but to reach Antwerp as quickly as possible. On September 4th, early in the morning, the vanguard of the 11th Armored Division burst into the city. This was a real shock for the Germans, who expected an offensive, but certainly not with such speed. The Antwerp garrison was caught by surprise. There was no time to organize a full-fledged defense, to mine and destroy port facilities as was usually done during a retreat. And here, the Belgian resistance entered the scene. These brave people, risking their lives, acted decisively and effectively. They didn't just inform the Allies about German movements, they actively prevented them from carrying out their plan to destroy the port. Blasting communication lines, sabotage on railway tracks, skirmishes with German sappers attempting to lay explosives, all of this played a key role. Thanks to their actions and the swiftness of the British tanks, Antwerp, with its priceless docks, berths, and cranes, was captured practically undamaged. This was a true gift for the Allies, for it was for the sake of this port, capable of receiving ocean-going vessels, that this entire offensive was launched. It seemed that the victory was complete and final. A key port, almost without a fight, was in Allied hands. The road to supplies, to a further offensive into Germany, was now open. But, as often happens in war, The most obvious victory can conceal the most insidious traps. And Antwerp, despite its seeming impregnability, was soon to become the arena for new, far more bloody battles. But the euphoria from the capture of Antwerp proved premature, and the seeming victory only half the battle. The Allies had gained the city, but not its functionality. The port, capable of accommodating ocean liners, remained useless without control over the 80-kilometer-long mouth of the Scheldt River. Imagine, you've seized the gates to a treasure vault, but the vault itself is locked with 100 locks, and the path to it is strewn with mines. This was precisely the situation with Antwerp. The Germans in their retreat didn't have time to destroy the port facilities, but they did manage to do something far more insidious. They turned the mouth of the Scheldt into an impregnable fortress. Tens of thousands of mines, hundreds of artillery pieces, bunkers, pillboxes, all this awaited Allied ships that dared to enter this deadly labyrinth. The islands at the river's mouth, such as Walcheren, were literally bristling with German soldiers, ready for a desperate defense. And it was here that the fatal mistake of the Allied command became apparent. Instead of immediately, after capturing Antwerp, throwing all forces into clearing the Scheldt estuary, the decision was made in favor of Operation Market Garden. All attention, all resources were directed to Holland, to an ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful airborne assault. This decision, made in headquarters hundreds of kilometers from the front line, cost the Allies precious time and thousands of lives. The generals, blinded by the prospect of a swift end to the war, did not realize the full criticality of the situation. They saw Antwerp on the map, but did not see that it was cut off from the sea, and thus from supplies. While British tanks stood idly in Antwerp, the Germans, taking advantage of the respite, fortified their positions along the Scheldt, transferring new units there. They understood that without this waterway, Antwerp was just another city, not the key to victory. The missed opportunity became a strategic miscalculation that prolonged the war by several months and led to one of the bloodiest battles on the Western Front, the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary. While the Allies reveled in their apparent victory, the Germans wasted no time. General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, commander of the 15th Army, found himself in an extremely difficult situation. His troops, retreating from Belgium, were literally trapped between the advancing Allied armies and the sea. It seemed like a hopeless position. But von Zangen was not one to surrender without a fight. He possessed not only military talent, but also an astonishing ability to organize amidst chaos. His task was incredibly complex. To evacuate tens of thousands of soldiers, thousands of pieces of equipment, and horses across the Scheldt estuary right under the enemy's nose, northward, to areas that would later become a beachhead for the defense of the approaches to Antwerp. This was a true logistical puzzle for which he had very little time to solve. The Germans, using every available boat, ferry, and barge, began a massive crossing. It resembled an exodus, but not a panicked one, rather a carefully planned one. Soldiers, officers, even civilians fleeing the advancing Allies all moved towards the crossings. The sky above the Scheldt swarmed with Allied aircraft, but the Germans, displaying miracles of camouflage and utilizing foggy nights, managed to minimize losses. This was one of the largest and most successful evacuations of World War II, often forgotten. The 15th Army, which the Allies had almost written off, not only avoided complete annihilation, but also retained its combat effectiveness. These forces, though battered, but hardened in battle, became the backbone of the German defense. They occupied strategically important positions along the Scheldt estuary, on the islands of Walcheren and Beveland, as well as on the mainland of Zealand. It was these soldiers, who miraculously escaped encirclement, who subsequently played a key role in repelling Allied attacks, turning the Scheldt estuary into an impregnable fortress. They organized a powerful layered defense, mined the waters, installed artillery batteries, and prepared positions for counterattacks. This maneuver by von Zangen became a true masterclass in retreat and regrouping, which delayed the Allies for a long time and forced them to pay a high price for every meter of land. While the Allied command was busy with its ambitious plans in Holland, the Germans, like a phoenix from the ashes, were reborn on a new frontier, preparing for a desperate struggle for a vital port. As the Germans, like ghosts, slipped away across the Scheldt, preparing for a new round of fighting, the Allies faced a reality they had ignored. Antwerp had been taken, but its security hung by a thread. East of the city, like a snake, twisted the Albert Canal, a water barrier of critical importance. It not only protected Antwerp from possible German counterattacks, but also formed part of the defensive line that the Germans were hastily fortifying. Canadian and Polish units, exhausted from the rapid advance, received orders to seize control of the canal crossings. This was not just a task, it was a race against time. The Germans, understanding the canal's strategic importance, threw all their forces into its defense. Every bridge, every ford, every section of the bank was turned into a mini fortress. The battles were fierce and bloody. Here, in this watery artery, which could become both a shield and a trap, real dramas unfolded. Canadian soldiers, accustomed to open spaces, learned to fight for every meter of land, for every dam, for every bridge. Polish units, eager for their homeland's freedom, displayed incredible courage, storming fortified enemy positions. They fought not only for Antwerp, but also for the opportunity to continue their path eastward. However, one of the most heroic episodes of this campaign was the battle for the bridgehead, which was named Joe. This was a small but strategically important salient on the eastern bank of the canal, which the Allies managed to capture. The Joe bridgehead became a true symbol of resilience and bravery. Small Allied units, surrounded, faced superior German forces that desperately tried to push them into the canal. The Germans perfectly understood that this bridgehead threatened their flank and could become a starting point for a further Allied offensive. They threw tanks, artillery, and fresh infantry units into battle. But the defenders of Joe held their ground. Day and night, they repelled attacks, fighting for every trench, for every dugout. It was a battle of attrition, where every shell, every bullet could decide the outcome of the fight. The Allied command, realizing the importance of the bridgehead, did everything possible to hold it, transferring reinforcements and supplies under continuous enemy fire. By holding Joe, these small units provided critical flanking cover for the main forces, which continued to advance and consolidate positions around Antwerp. Without their selflessness and steadfastness, the further course of events could have taken a completely different turn. The battles for the Albert Canal and the Joe bridgehead served as a brutal reminder that even after the capture of a key city, the war does not end. It merely moves to a new, no less bloody stage, where every meter of land, every water barrier becomes an arena for fierce battles. And while the Allies fought for control of the canals and bridges, a new, much larger and more complex battle was already looming on the horizon. The battle for the Scheldt estuary, which promised to be one of the toughest tests for the Allied troops. While the Canadians and Poles heroically held the Albert Canal, the Allied command finally realized the full depth of their strategic error. Antwerp was useless as long as the mouth of the Scheldt remained in German hands. Moreover, with each passing week, German defenses became more impregnable. The time had come for decisive action. Thus was born Operation Switchback, the code name for one of the most difficult and bloody campaigns of World War II. Its goal was simple and terrifyingly complex at the same time: to clear an 80-kilometer stretch of the Scheldt estuary of the enemy, to open the way to Antwerp. The development of the plan fell on the shoulders of the Canadian First Army under the command of General Guy Simons. He had to solve a problem that at first glance seemed impossible: to dislodge the Germans from the flooded, canal-ridden Zeeland landscape, where every patch of dry land was fortified and the water held deadly danger. The forces were unequal. The Allies had numerical superiority, but the Germans had the advantage of defending terrain they had turned into a true fortress. The 15th Army of the Wehrmacht, which had managed to avoid encirclement, was now dug in, using every bunker, every dam, every artillery nest. They knew they were defending the last barrier on the way to the heart of Germany, and were ready to fight to the death. The tactical tasks of the Canadian First Army were divided into several stages. First, it was necessary to clear the southern bank of the estuary, the so-called Breskin's Pocket. Then, to take the islands of Walcheren and North Beveland, which blocked the mouth of the river. Each of these stages required a unique approach and was incredibly complex. The specifics of warfare in the flooded Zeeland landscape were unlike anything the Allies had encountered before. Water was everywhere. Roads, fields, villages, everything was submerged, turning the landscape into a labyrinth of narrow dams, canals, and boggy swamps. The movement of armored vehicles was extremely difficult, and the infantry constantly risked falling into a trap or being blown up by mines hidden underwater. The Germans skillfully used these conditions, building fortifications on small elevations and using canals as natural defensive lines. Every bridge, every crossing became an arena for fierce battles. The Allies had to use engineering units on an unprecedented scale, build pontoon bridges under fire, use amphibious equipment, and devise new tactics to advance through this inhospitable land. Operation Switchback began in early October 1944. This was not just a battle for a port, it was a battle for the very possibility of continuing the offensive into Germany. A battle that promised to be long, agonizing, and extremely bloody, but without which victory was unthinkable. The Allies entered this battle understanding that they would have to overcome not only the stubborn resistance of the enemy, but also nature itself, which seemed to be on the side of the Germans. But there was no other way. Antwerp waited, and with it, the hope for a swift end to the war. Operation Switchback began, and the Canadian First Army was about to face a true hell on earth. The southern bank of the Scheldt estuary, known as the Breskin's Pocket, was the first and most challenging objective. Here, the German 64th Infantry Division had dug in, a unit hardened in battle and fanatically loyal to the Reich. They perfectly understood the strategic importance of this sector and were prepared to fight to the last bullet, to the last soldier. The terrain was a nightmare for the attackers, a flat, table-like lowland crisscrossed by countless canals, dikes, and drainage ditches. Most of it was flooded, turning into a viscous, marshy quagmire where any movement of armored vehicles was tantamount to suicide. The Germans skillfully used these natural barriers, creating a powerful, layered defense. Every farmhouse, every grove, every embankment was turned into a fortified strongpoint, connected by underground passages and trenches. The fields were strewn with mines, and the canals with anti-tank obstacles and barriers. Aerial reconnaissance showed one thing: this would not be just a battle, but a bloody meat grinder. Canadian troops, accustomed to more dynamic battles, encountered unprecedented resistance. The battle for the Breskens Pocket became a series of grueling fights for every meter of land, for every dike, for every canal. Advancing units faced dense machine gun and mortar fire. German snipers worked tirelessly, turning advancement into a deadly lottery. The problem of the flooded terrain required unconventional solutions. Allied engineers, demonstrating miracles of ingenuity, built temporary bridges from improvised materials, used amphibious vehicles that could move on water and land, and even improvised with rafts to transport infantry and light equipment. One of the most effective tactical innovations was the use of kangaroos, armored personnel carriers converted from tanks which could transport infantry across rough terrain, providing them with protection from enemy fire. Flamethrower tanks, Crocodile, were also actively used, capable of burning out German bunkers and fortifications. But even these innovations could not completely negate the advantages of the defenders. The Germans, despite the Canadians' numerical superiority, held out with the stubbornness of the doomed. They knew that the fate of the port, and thus their entire army, depended on their steadfastness. Soldiers of the 64th Infantry Division fought from every trench, from every shelter, inflicting heavy losses on the attackers. Battles often took place at very close quarters, escalating into hand-to-hand combat. The Canadians, making their way through water and mud, overcame one obstacle after another. But each step came at the cost of heavy losses. The Breskens Pocket became a mass grave for thousands of soldiers on both sides. It was a battle where heroism and despair intertwined into a single knot, where every day brought new challenges and new sacrifices. But the Canadians knew, without taking the southern bank of the Scheldt, Antwerp would never operate at full capacity. And they continued to fight, step by step, approaching their goal through mud, blood, and fire. While Canadian soldiers were fighting their way through the swamps of the Breskens Pocket, a far more formidable obstacle loomed on the horizon. Walcheren Island, located on the northern bank of the Scheldt, was a veritable, impregnable fortress. It was not just an island, but a key element of the German defenses, blocking access to the port of Antwerp. Its shores were dotted with powerful artillery batteries, bunkers, pillboxes, and minefields. Thousands of German soldiers, having gone through the harsh school of the Eastern Front, were ready to meet any enemy. Allied command understood. Without the capture of Walcheren, Antwerp would remain a dead weight. But how to take an island transformed into a continuous, fortified area, surrounded by water and defended by fanatical resistance? The decision made by the Allies was dramatic and bold, but, as it turned out, the only possible one. It was decided to flood the island, not completely, but enough to neutralize German fortifications and make the defense more vulnerable. On October 8, 1944, after long debates and heavy deliberations, British bombers took to the sky. Their target was the dikes protecting Walcheren from the sea. The first breach was made in the West Capelle dike, followed by others. Huge masses of seawater poured onto the island, flooding fields, roads, German trenches, and bunkers. It was a terrible but necessary sight. Thousands of homes were destroyed, thousands of civilians were left homeless, but it was the only way to victory. The flooding of the island had a dual effect. First, it destroyed German lines of communication and supply, turning land fortifications into isolated islets. Second, it created conditions for an amphibious operation, which was to become the culmination of the Battle of Walcheren. The dramatic decision to flood the island was made despite the understanding of its devastating consequences for the local population. The water, becoming an ally, turned the landscape into chaos. But it was this chaos that was to break the German defense. And so, when the water began to recede, revealing destroyed fortifications and creating new paths for the offensive, it was time for the decisive blow. On November 3, 1944, the amphibious operation began. British commandos and Marines, specially trained for such tasks, landed on the western and eastern coasts of Walcheren. It was one of the most difficult and dangerous landing operations of the war. Under the cover of naval artillery and aviation, assault groups advanced through the flooded terrain, encountering fierce German resistance, who, despite all difficulties, continued to fight with desperate bravery. The battles were tenacious. Every bunker, every pillbox had to be taken by storm. Commandos, using flamethrowers, explosives, and hand-to-hand combat, slowly but surely advanced deeper into the island. Marines, overcoming water obstacles, attacked German positions, not allowing the enemy to regroup. It was a battle of attrition, where every meter of land cost lives. But the Allies understood that the fate of the entire port of Antwerp depended on the success of this operation, and they were ready to pay any price. While battles raged on the fields of Belgium and the Netherlands, and the Allies reclaimed land inch by inch, a different, no less crucial struggle unfolded in the shadow of these grand events. The Belgian resistance, fragmented yet brave, played a key role in saving the port of Antwerp. These people, risking their own lives, acted decisively to prevent a catastrophe. When the Germans began to retreat from the city, their order was unequivocal: destroy the port infrastructure, render it useless to the Allies. But the Patriots were not asleep. They sabotaged mining attempts, diffused explosives, and passed valuable information to the Allies about the movements of German sappers. Thanks to their actions and the swiftness of British tanks, the port was captured without significant destruction. This was an invaluable contribution that saved the Allies months of rebuilding and allowed them to focus on clearing the Scheldt. However, the resistance's role was not limited to saving the port. Belgian patriots actively participated in the battles for the country's liberation, operating behind enemy lines, disrupting communications, setting ambushes, and transmitting intelligence. They were the eyes and ears of the Allied armies, their invisible but powerful ally. But the life of Antwerp's civilian population was far from triumphant. Liberation brought not only joy, but also new challenges. The city found itself under the crosshairs of deadly German weapons. V-1 and V-2 rockets, the world's first ballistic missiles, rained down on Antwerp, turning it into a target for indiscriminate and destructive strikes. These vengeance weapons brought death and destruction, without distinguishing between military and civilian. Thousands of residents died, many were left homeless, and the psychological pressure from the constant threat from the sky was unbearable. People lived in constant fear, not knowing when or where the next rocket would fall. The plight of the civilian population was extremely difficult. Destruction, hunger, the constant threat of death all became part of their daily lives. And in these conditions, as the city bled, relations between the various political factions of the resistance became increasingly tense. The resistance was not a monolithic force. It consisted of many groups with different political views, from communists to royalists, from socialists to Christian Democrats. All were united by a common goal: the liberation of the country. But after Belgium's liberation, disagreements began to surface. Disputes about the country's future, about the role of the government in exile, about methods of restoring order. All this created a complex and sometimes conflict-ridden atmosphere. There were instances of clashes between different factions, attempts to seize local power, which, of course, did not contribute to unity and stability. The Allied command, in turn, tried to maintain order and prevent major conflicts, understanding that internal strife could weaken the newly liberated country. The role of the Belgian resistance and the civilian population in the battle for Antwerp and the liberation of the country was enormous. Their courage, resilience, and sacrifice became an integral part of the overall victory, despite internal disagreements and the horrors experienced under the V1 and V2 bombardments. They showed that war is not only a battle of armies, but also a battle of spirit, a battle for survival and for the future. With the liberation of Walcheren and the Breskin's pocket, the Battle of the Scheldt seemed to be over. The path to Antwerp was open. But this was only the beginning of a new, no less dangerous and painstaking work. The Germans, retreating, left behind a deadly legacy. Thousands of mines of all types strewn across the riverbed and coastal waters. This was one of the largest and most complex mine-clearing operations in history. Imagine a labyrinth of steel and explosives, where every step, every maneuver could cost a life. British and Canadian engineering units, as well as specially trained divers, faced an unprecedented challenge. The bottom of the Scheldt was littered with bottom mines, magnetic mines, acoustic mines, booby traps, a real arsenal of death that was waiting for its hour. The work was carried out around the clock in the most difficult conditions. Cold water, strong currents, poor visibility. All this made demining incredibly dangerous. Divers, risking their lives, descended to the bottom, manually diffusing mines or setting charges to detonate them. Every day brought new casualties, but the work did not stop for a minute. Simultaneously with demining, port brigades and Allied engineers began to restore Antwerp's infrastructure. Although the port itself was captured almost intact, it still needed to be prepared to receive a huge number of ships. Thousands of tons of debris, wreckage, sunken ships, all this had to be removed. Cranes, docks, railway tracks, all this required inspection, repair, and modernization. The work proceeded at a frantic pace. Brigades worked 7 days a week, understanding that the fate of the entire offensive depended on their efforts. While sappers cleared the Scheldt of mines, port workers restored berths, laid new railway lines, and repaired warehouses. It was a real race against time because every day of delay meant a postponement in the delivery of vital cargo to the front. And finally, on November 28, 1944, after 2 months of intense work and heavy losses, the mouth of the Scheldt was declared safe for navigation. On this day, the first convoy entered Antwerp. 85 ships, fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies, slowly but surely moved up the river. It was a triumph of will, courage, and engineering thought. The first ship to enter the port was the American transport James B. McGregor, loaded with 3,000 tons of ammunition. Others followed. Thousands of soldiers, workers, civilians came ashore to meet these ships, which carried not only cargo, but also hope. This was the moment when Antwerp finally began to fulfill its strategic role. The opening of the port became a turning point in Allied logistics. Now that huge volumes of cargo could be delivered directly to Belgium, the supply problem that had so long choked the offensive began to recede. However, the Germans were not going to give up. They understood the strategic importance of Antwerp and were preparing for a final, desperate thrust. But that is another story entirely. The opening of the port of Antwerp seemed to mark the end of an epic. The Allies had finally acquired their supply artery. But the German command, despite the catastrophic situation on the fronts, was not going to reconcile itself to the loss of this strategic object. They understood that Antwerp was the heart of Allied logistics, and without it, the offensive into Germany would falter. And so, in mid-December 1944, when the Allies already smelled victory, the Germans made a last, desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to us as the Ardennes Offensive, was a grandiose and incredibly risky plan by Adolf Hitler. Its goal was simple and ambitious: to break through the Allied defenses in the Ardennes, reach the coast, encircle the main British and American forces, repeating the success of 1940, and, most importantly, capture Antwerp. The capture of the port would mean not only the paralysis of Allied supplies, but also possibly their complete defeat. This would allow the Germans to gain time, regroup, and possibly even conclude a separate peace with the Western powers to focus on the Eastern Front. German tank divisions, secretly assembled and thrown into battle in bad weather conditions, which nullified Allied air superiority, moved forward. It was a powerful, unexpected blow that caught the Allies off guard. The American defenses in the Ardennes were thin, and German tanks, like an avalanche, broke through them, rushing westward. With each hour they approached Antwerp, the threat was real and palpable. German advance units approached within just 100 kilometers of the city. In Antwerp, where work on unloading ships was in full swing, panic began. The port, which had just opened, could be lost. The Allied command, recovering from the initial shock, took emergency measures. All forces that could be withdrawn from other sectors of the front were thrown to defend Antwerp and contain the breakthrough in the Ardennes. Soldiers, engineers, port workers, all were mobilized. Garrisons were reinforced, anti-tank barriers were installed on the approaches to the city. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns were mobilized to cover against possible air attacks. The importance of Antwerp to the Allies was so great that its loss would have been tantamount to a strategic defeat. It was the last, desperate lunge of a dying beast which, despite all its hopelessness, made the Allies nervous and forced them to throw all their forces into defending this vital logistical hub. The opening of the port of Antwerp seemed to mark the end of the epic. The Allies had finally acquired their supply artery. But the German command, despite the catastrophic situation on the fronts, was not prepared to accept the loss of this strategic asset. They understood that Antwerp was the heart of Allied logistics, and without it, the advance into Germany would falter. And so, in mid-December 1944, when the Allies were already smelling victory, the Germans made a last, desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to us as the Ardennes Offensive, was a grand and incredibly risky plan by Adolf Hitler. Its goal was simple and ambitious: to break through Allied defenses in the Ardennes, reach the coast, encircle the main British and American forces, repeating the success of 1940, and, most importantly, capture Antwerp. The capture of the port would mean not only the paralysis of Allied supplies, but also, possibly, their complete defeat. This would allow the Germans to gain time, regroup, and perhaps even conclude a separate peace with the Western powers to concentrate on the Eastern Front. German tank divisions, secretly assembled and thrown into battle in bad weather conditions that nullified Allied air superiority, moved forward. It was a powerful, unexpected blow that caught the Allies off guard. The American defenses in the Ardennes were thin, and German tanks, like an avalanche, broke through them, rushing westward. With each hour, they approached Antwerp. The threat was real and palpable. German advanced units came within just 100 kilometers of the city. In Antwerp, where work on unloading ships was in full swing, panic broke out. The port, which had just opened, could be lost. The Allied command, recovering from the initial shock, took emergency measures. All forces that could be withdrawn from other sectors of the front were thrown into the defense of Antwerp and containing the breakthrough in the Ardennes. Soldiers, engineers, port workers, everyone was mobilized. Garrisons were strengthened, anti-tank barriers were installed on the approaches to the city. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns were mobilized to cover against possible air attacks. The importance of Antwerp to the Allies was so great that its loss would have been tantamount to a strategic defeat. It was the last, desperate lunge of a dying beast, which, despite all its hopelessness, made the Allies nervous and forced them to throw all their forces into protecting this vital logistical hub. The Battle for Antwerp, a multi-month epic, became one of the most illustrative battles of World War II, whose lessons remain relevant to this day. Its historical significance is difficult to overestimate. On the one hand, it demonstrated the incredible resilience and heroism of Allied soldiers, their ability to overcome not only desperate enemy resistance, but also monstrous natural conditions. On the other hand, this battle vividly exposed the consequences of strategic miscalculations made at the highest levels of command. The main one, undoubtedly, was the delay in the operation to clear the Scheldt estuary. Having captured Antwerp itself in the first half of September 1944, the Allies did not immediately throw all their forces into ensuring its operability. Instead, attention and resources were diverted to Operation Market Garden, an ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful attempt to end the war with one swift blow. This decision cost the Allies not only precious weeks and months, but also thousands of lives. The Germans, taking advantage of the pause, were able to regroup, strengthen the defenses of the Scheldt estuary, and turn it into an impregnable fortress. If the estuary had been captured in September, the port would have become fully operational by early October. This would have significantly accelerated the delivery of supplies to the front, ensuring a continuous Allied offensive. Historians still debate how much earlier the war in Europe could have ended, if not for this miscalculation. Many agree that the months lost on the Scheldt could have cost the Allies the opportunity to advance much deeper into Germany before winter, possibly even before Christmas 1944. This, in turn, could have prevented or significantly weakened the German Ardennes counteroffensive, which became the last bloody surge of the Wehrmacht on the Western Front. The lessons learned were harsh, but important. Logistics and troop supply play no less and sometimes an even greater role than tactical success on the battlefield. Ignoring vital communications can lead to a protracted war and unjustified losses, even if the immediate military operation was successful. The Battle for Antwerp will forever remain in history as an example of how a strategic error caused by excessive overconfidence and underestimation of the enemy can have far-reaching and tragic consequences.